Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. Let's dive right into it. It is an understatement that we live in a politically tumultuous era. In the past 124 years alone, we have seen the rise and fall of a lot of different political theories and the massive movements that each of them had. As a matter of fact, it could be argued that modern politics is what shaped the march of human progress, all throughout history. It has been monarchs, dictators, presidents, emperors, and tyrants who have fostered countries that have either birthed great innovations in the fields of technology, agriculture, literature, and medicine, or they have held groundswells of violence, brainwashing, or even justified the most heinous crimes that we've seen in the last couple of centuries. But none of this has been isolated to just modern human history. And we're talking post-industrialization. The politics of any realm or region have always driven what direction a people head in. The same is true for science fiction, fantasy, and their predecessors in various mythologies. In ancient Greece, Rome, China, Persia, Norway, the politics of the gods are the stories that have made their way to today's interpretations and sound really familiar to what we have going on right now. History is very cyclical. It likes to repeat itself in cycles and waves. The technology might be different, the medicine, agriculture, all of the advancements might be a little bit different, but the stories usually remain the same. Because there's that inner bit of human spirit and tenacity and hubris that is woven within our collective that I don't think will ever quite evolve beyond. Now, in those old mythologies, we've had bickering among the pantheons, and that was used to explain the calamities or the wars that raged, the fighting against these monsters or titans. The ancient gods of old mythologies directly reflected pinnacles of what people saw in their own leaders and cultures. If you read through Greek mythology, let's take Zeus for an example. Zeus was a powerful leader. He was the epitome of strength and fatherly wisdom, and yet he was a horrific slut. He would not keep it in his pants. He would sleep around with everybody. And he would lead his wife Hera to hate and rebel against him. So it can be inferred that this is how the Greeks of the age saw their leaders. And if you look at Greek or Greco-Roman history, it turns out to be very much the case. They would both be very flawed and full of hubris, yet still individuals that you would want to follow because they were wise, they were strong, they would win in the end. And we do the same thing with modern myth in, say, the form of comic books. Just look at the two most famous, Superman and Batman. Both full of flaws and weaknesses, but also people that we have made into symbols of justice and leadership. But, alas, they are not immune to politics either. Just watch the Justice League shows or read the comics. I think The Boys does a pretty good job highlighting just how involved politics makes itself in regard to modern day heroes and villains and the modern myth. Speaking of the modern myth, and leading into science fiction, Star Wars itself is set against this enormous backdrop of major political tumult. If you, I mean, you can't tell the story without it. If you take out the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, the galactic scale issues that led to so much dissent that almost half of the galaxy became separatists and waged war, and then you have each individual planets having their own scalable political bodies like Naboo and Toydaria. If you take all of that out, it's an incredibly different story. And it's not going to be as good. Star Wars is steeped in politics, and it is absolutely necessary to tell that story. And all of these stories that are making up the tapestry of the Star Wars universe. It's something that we have in droves in the old Legends expanded universe as well. And it's used really well, in my opinion. Star Wars is one of those properties that has political aspects in it that I think could be... you could make whole college classes around the politics in Star Wars. Just the questions raised alone by certain events. I mean, they're enough to set political science professors at most universities on their back foot, right? Because they're also applicable to today's day and age. How do you justly wage war against a tyrannical government, let's say? Do you become the monster that you're fighting against in order to remove that monster? This is a great example that we have in Luthen Rael in Andor, in that speech he gives. He becomes his enemy in order to destroy his enemy. He sacrifices his soul and who he is in order to preserve the sunrise that he knows he'll never see. That's pretty powerful. And the list goes on. What, if any, civilian casualties are justifiable in ousting that oppressive government? If things like slavery, genocide, corruption are all reprehensible and evil, and we would want our government to not do all of those things, then how do we as a general population stand against that? Where are the lines drawn between anarchy, revolution, rebellion, and terrorism? Newsflash, folks. These are the questions that Star Wars deals with. And if you really dive into it, it's so much fun. Now, properties like Star Wars, Stargate, Battlestar Galactica, Farscape, Star Trek, they're all great examples of these kinds of questions being posed, and we even get some answers to a few of them. I don't think politics is at the forefront of what people think when sci-fi comes to mind, but it obviously plays a really important role in the events of all of these stories. Although zooming out a bit, I think a really fair question to ask is, what is the best way to include politics in science fiction? How can we use it to where it amplifies the story and makes it better? Because talking politics, like, it's Thanksgiving all over again, right? You don't want to get into it. It's something that everyone's super sensitive about. It's like a massive toothache in everyone's brain. If you poke it, then people react really vehemently and violently against it. So it's a slippery slope when we write touchy subjects like politics into a story, because it is really easy to impose our own views and beliefs on what we write, which sounds paradoxical, because why wouldn't our views and beliefs be woven into our work? But I think we are very much called as writers to go beyond our own beliefs and understanding of things. I would argue that this is what Lucas did with Star Wars. Yes, the Vietnam War was going on at the time, and it definitely colored part of Star Wars. But Lucas made those colorings very broad and open to interpretation, because Lucas was a bit of a student of history, and he understood that there will always be an evil empire. There is always an oppressive regime that's seeking dominance over others. It wasn't just regulated to what was going on during his time, his era in creating Star Wars. So how do we do it? How do we go about politics in our sci-fi stories? Well, I think starting from the ground up is probably the best method. Build out your world first. Create the story first. And then add in whatever makes sense. If you're writing a story and then, let's say your group of main characters come across some shady deals, right? That corrupt politicians are making as part of the background of whatever is going on. You might start with that first. Go get into those dirty deals that the politicians are making and pull the thread. However your story is set up, you could go into a bunch of different directions. Maybe it leads you to a place that you didn't expect, right? Maybe those dirty politicians are doing these things to protect their families. Maybe they're part of a death cult that worships Azathoth, and their deals are funding that growing cult. Maybe they're doing this because the people in power have just no choice. It's do or die, quite literally. Or maybe they're just mired in cowardice and greed. I think as long as the reasoning for politics being in a story is justified, even to a small degree, it doesn't have to take up the entire story, then it's a pretty great writing tool to utilize. When I don't think it's so great is when it's clearly there to superimpose a modern narrative that is epitomized very clearly in one modern political party or movement. This latest season of The Boys is getting a lot of flack for just that, actually. Homelander is now basically an analogy for an interpretation of Donald Trump, and the Homelanders are clearly supposed to be a radicalized representation of his Make America Great Again movement. Now, this was not received very well by a majority of The Boys fans, as far as I can tell. And it's no wonder, considering who the main audience that watches The Boys is. You can take that as you will. It's mostly dudes. It's mostly dudes that like comics. Mostly people that have stomachs for some pretty gruesome, horrendous, and gory, graphic things. There's someone that has the Ant-Man power and can shrink super small, and he literally explodes the guy by sneezing in while he is inside the urethra of a dick, and explodes that dude from the inside when he accidentally turns back into normal size. It's a wild show. And that's the show that its creative team decided to politicize to get across not even a message, but a sort of political signaling that Homelander and his movement are clearly what Donald Trump and his Republican base are. They're a bunch of psychotic, evil killers, and they're perfectly fine with things like genocide and corruption, and everything that goes with it. And that's a really tough stance to take for a writing team. And I can understand why, even if you don't identify with the American Republican Party, this is really annoying to you, because you watch something like The Boys as a method of escapism, right? It is fantastical. It is supposed to be so far removed from reality, while having a slight touch of realism that we can all kind of connect to. And it's not supposed to be more of the same of what we deal with all day, every day in reality. We watch this to get away from reality. And if the creative team wants to create a really hyper-realized version of something that's pretty prominent in reality, that is a really touchy subject for just about everybody in the United States, and then superimpose that over something that had not been incredibly political or part of what was politically divisive in America, it's justifiable why people are not getting behind this season, why there was so much criticism. It's tough to do, and it's tough to get past. And it's a great argument against including modern political narratives in stories to kind of shoehorn certain beliefs or views. Now, conversely, stories that are all about politics and their movements, like Animal Farm or 1984, they do just that. They are all about the politics and the movements of the author's eras. And it is very clear from the start, it is not trying to be something that it isn't. And it didn't spend 3 or 4 seasons being something different. And then all of a sudden, it leaned really heavily into one aspect of the story. I use words like foundation and cornerstone because it's kind of what they are. If you put too much weight on one, the others might collapse. The structure will get too weak, and the whole story could crumble. But these stories like Animal Farm in 1984, they are remembered and studied and revered because they tell you up front what they're about, and they don't try to do that. They don't try to take over something that already exists to become a piece of political propaganda. Pun intended. And Star Wars and Star Trek are the same way. You're told in the story about all the political aspects and how they move the story forward. Nothing is implied. The audience isn't told how to think or feel. Rather, we are actually left with a ton of questions. Things that deal with ethics, morality, spirituality, how we define ourselves, all that fun jazz. So I think politics in sci-fi is probably best used when it leaves people with questions rather than only offering answers, like The Boys is currently doing. Make no mistake about it, though. The Empire is evil. Homelander is a psychotic killer. And the Borg should be stopped at all costs. But those are just the answers, the end of the journey. The important bits are what we find on the journey, how we come to those conclusions. If I'm building a house that I'm going to live in for the rest of my life, I would want to know how it's made. The materials, the foundation, the life expectancy of the roof. All of that. I am happy that I have the house, absolutely. But all of that other information is pretty critical for a ton of reasons. And I don't think that we need to be scared to voice our political beliefs or views or whatever. Although I do think we need to be wary of tribalism becoming that evil empire or that psychopath wanting to impose our own beliefs and ways of life on others. And I get it. It's really easy to fall into. There's this, like I said before, there's this bit of humanity that's woven into all of us to want to protect whatever group we're a part of, whatever team or side we're on, whatever tribe houses us. We want to protect that, no matter how flawed it might be, no matter how wrong it is sometimes. We let that side get away with things. We let it just kind of run wild every now and then without holding it accountable, keeping it in check. And we can't do that. I do think that makes for a pretty great story, though. It's something that made Star Wars. All through the Clone Wars, the Chancellor just getting more and more power until he's able to become the Emperor. So, yeah, I thought this would be pretty appropriate to bring up here, especially since it's election season. The U.S. presidential election is right around the corner. And yeah, that would be my message to everybody. Don't let it control you. Don't let it influence you. Keep a rein on it. Check yourself. If everyone does that, then we could shift or stop or change quite a bit. Don't ever let anyone tell you that the individual doesn't matter, because the group is all that matters. The individual is what makes up the group. And the individual is really very much important. But yeah, that is all I had time for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning back in. Stick around for more Sci-Fi Unchained. But for now, live long and prosper, my friends. And may the Force be with us all.